This session is about the concepts of inclusive growth and what might a wellbeing budget mean. Now, these are topics that are bandied around quite a lot these days. They used to be bandied around quite a lot only in the positive fashion, but they've now become pejorative, and there's all sorts of critiques about it. And I suspect that some of the heat in the debate is about to take a further step up, given the reaction to the Treasurer's recent article in the Monthly, which some people might find inexceptional, but clearly others don't. And if you look at the Australian today, it appeared to receive more coverage than the funeral of former Cardinal Pell. I won't make any further remarks on that, but that's a major shift in the direction of the Australian. So this is clearly an important topic, and we have assembled some important people and some experts on it. So sitting next to me here is Dr. Daniel Mulino, who people will know is the reasonably newly minted, well, not so much newly, but a comparatively newly minted member for Fraser, chair of the Economics Committee in the Parliament, and last year author of a new book which looks at exploring the welfare state and why we should value it, but also, how we should look at measuring its performance and its design. Next to Daniel is Shireen Morris. Shireen may be very familiar to many of you for her contributions over recent years on things like The Voice. But late last year, she also had some things to say about the topics we're about to talk about now in a quite interesting John Button Oration. And for those of you who haven't read it, I'd recommend you seek it out online. It's available quite readily. And finally, next to Shireen, we have a definitely newly minted Victorian Upper House MP in Ryan Batchelor. But Ryan has also had an extensive background as both a senior public servant in the policy area and also a senior ministerial and indeed Prime Ministerial Adviser. So he's often had the task of trying to put some of these concepts to life. So I'd like to invite each of the panellists to outline a bit of their view of the world, and we'll shift into a general discussion, and then we'll have a Q&A. Absolutely, yeah.
So hi everyone, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to their elders past and present. So for me, inclusive growth should mean, obviously, decreasing inequality rather than increasing inequality, leaving the next generation better off than the one before, rather than worse off than the one before, across all indicators of economic, social, environmental and cultural prosperity. It should mean that wages grow as profits grow. It should mean improving educational achievements by global standards rather than decreasing educational achievements by global standards. And importantly, it should mean that the number of long-term unemployed and underemployed Australians steadily declines and disappears, because I think all Australians should have the right and opportunity to work. Unfortunately, none of this is really happening now. But Australia, I don't think, can reverse current trajectories of growing inequality and declining generational prosperity unless we fundamentally change the way we talk about and think about the economy and have the courage to reform the systems, institutions, values and assumptions that underpin economic policy. So I argued in my John Button Oration that the Keating and Hawke Accord forged what people like Adrian Pabst, and I think even Keating himself, called a radical centre synthesis in economic policy. But that productive synthesis, achieved through negotiation, is now around 40 years old, and I think it has ossified over time, it's declined, and it's become unfit for purpose. Even Keating in 2017 said the liberal economy has become stale and needs urgent rejuvenation. And what was our response when Keating, the creator of the liberal economy, said that? Nothing. We didn't have much to say. I really think we need to acknowledge the deep contradiction that is now present at the heart of all economic policy. On the one hand, government says rightly we need to reduce inequality, we need to tackle disadvantage in particular regions and remote communities, and as Jim Chalmers says, we need to make sure that opportunities spread to places like Logan, Lismore and Launceston, not to mention remote Indigenous communities where intergenerational disadvantage is entrenched. But on the other hand, policymakers kind of passively observe and implicitly endorse the central bank raising interest rates to fight inflation, which is hurting workers, slowing growth, and eventually will increase unemployment. So this means workers least well positioned to pay for the problems in our economy are being forced to pay. The same workers who didn't cause inflation are being forced to pay for it, sometimes with their livelihoods. So how can we address inequality if policymakers across left and right accept that monetary policy should deliberately keep a cohort of Australians unemployed to control inflation? How can we seriously say that we're doing things to fix disadvantage in this country at the same time as sitting back and passively observing current historically low unemployment rates slowly going back up due to rate rises? This deep contradiction leads to some very weird contortions in public policy debate, like the strained over-insistence that the central bank is independent, as if the government has no power over it, when actually the government has supreme power over it. The government created it and gave it its legislative mandate. Or the surreptitious dropping of the word full from the Full Employment White Paper, or what was supposed to be the Full Employment White Paper. But now that we can see unemployment going back up, maybe it's not politically convenient for us to call it that anymore. I really think a Labor government needs to aim higher. We need to question the orthodoxy. We need to grapple with and more fairly resolve this contradiction, because if a Labor government doesn't do it, who's going to do it? And I really think the time is now, because people are actually talking about this. The International Monetary Fund head, Olivia Blanchard, tweeted this week that we can and should dream of a negotiation between workers, firms and the state in which stable prices are achieved without requiring a painful slowdown. So as I argued in my oration, I think we need to negotiate a new radical centre accord. We need to forge a fairer synthesis between the dual important goals of price stability and true full employment. Now that could mean counterbalancing inflation targeting with a true full employment target, not the dishonesty that says 4 or 5% unemployed is true full employment. It could mean properly incorporating, or at least grappling with, turning our minds to the idea of a federal job guarantee, which some people argue is an alternative and superior way of controlling inflation and stabilising the economy. It could mean sensible price controls, because why should the most vulnerable be forced to pay for price stability? Why shouldn't big corporations forego some of their handsome profits to help keep prices stable? Of course, all this is politically hard, very politically hard, but it really requires changing the narrative and changing the way we think about the economy. And that's what I think is the real opportunity of Jim Chalmers' idea of a well-being budget, right? And what I think policymakers should think about is the opportunity to reform John Howard's dishonestly titled Charter of Budget Honesty, which currently requires governments only to measure things like surplus debt and deficit. But imagine if we could reform that charter to require governments to measure things in the real world that really matter to us, like inequality, home ownership, educational rankings against global standards, emissions, progress towards true full employment. Viewed in proper perspective, I really do think Australians across left and right would support budget deficits that guaranteed a job for every Australian who needs work. I'll leave it there, thank you.
Well, thank you, Shireen, for throwing that out there. Shireen is, of course, the head of the Radical Reform Lab. Well, that was a pretty challenging address from the defined non-economist on the panel. What do the economists have to say, Daniel?
Thanks very much, David. Can I also begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. Thanks also to the Chifley Institute for today for bringing together great panels, but also so many policy thinkers in this room. It's been a really wonderful opportunity. I wanted to focus today on the wellbeing budget, wellbeing measures and GDP. So my task was to add a bit of pizzazz and vaudeville to calculating GDP. I hadn't put any explicit comments in here about monetary policy and the relationship between the government and the central bank, but happy to make a couple of brief remarks on that afterwards if that would be useful. But really, I wanted to look at the wellbeing budget in terms of what I see as a couple of opportunities. And when I was preparing for today, one famous quote around GDP jumped out at me, and that was Robert Kennedy, who said that GDP measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile. And he wasn't the first person to criticise GDP, and he certainly hasn't been the last person. And the limitations of GDP, I think, are one of the bases upon which we are now having a discussion around wellbeing budgets, around wellbeing measures, and the way in which that might impact decision making. I did want to go back to the origins of GDP, though. GDP is actually a much more recent measure than I think many people would imagine. We often look at GDP measures going back millennia and imagine that it's just always been there as the way in which we measure things. But in fact, Simon Kuznets in the late 30s was the statistician who came up with GDP as a way to come up with a holistic measure of the economy. And measuring GDP across a number of countries didn't really happen until after Bretton Woods in '44. And it isn't really till the late 70s that you find measures of GDP across dozens of countries. There's a famous paper in 1978. And indeed, you look at the work of someone like Angus Maddison, who tried to measure GDP, but also welfare. He looked at things like work-life balance, like how many hours people worked across many countries and going back hundreds of years. A lot of his seminal pieces, The World Economy Over the Last Millennia, weren't published until the 90s or 2001. So GDP itself is quite a recent phenomenon in the world of economic thinking and statistics, and GDP itself is, I would say, a real work in progress. So I think that's important for context, and I think it's also important to note that someone like Kuznets fully understood a lot of the limitations of GDP. Whenever you try to reduce something very complex to a single measure, there are lots of pitfalls. He was an incredibly accomplished statistician, but also a very nuanced development economist who understood that you have to look at economies in their historical context and all sorts of other subtleties. So he was a very sophisticated development economist and statistician. Now, what is the goal of GDP? Well, I would say one of them is to come up with the holistic measure, so one measure for the whole economy. And if you compare a lot of commentary on the economy before GDP had been developed, a lot of it was very ad hoc, you might say, very output focused, very industry focused. So there really weren't very good measures of the overall economy before GDP. The other thing that I'd say about GDP is that it has a well-defined criterion for inclusion, which is that it's a market transaction of a final good. Now, that's a good thing in that we all agree, by and large, on what's going to be in and what's going to be out, albeit at the margins, even that's hard to measure sometimes. But that's also one of its weaknesses. So I would argue that the strengths of GDP, that it's a holistic measure and that it's based upon fairly well-defined criteria, are also, on the flip side, its weaknesses. The fact that it's a holistic measure but with scope issues means that we, as the previous discussion focused on, we exclude non-market transactions. So there are all sorts of things that are excluded. So it's not truly holistic, but I don't think anything will ever be truly holistic. It tries to use a well-defined criteria, but that criteria, again, is a weakness because it measures dollar transactions, which means it's not measuring things like outcomes. It's not measuring things like well-being or happiness. It's not measuring distribution. So I would say that GDP's strengths are also its weaknesses. And these are things to bear in mind when we come up with alternatives. So well-being measures are things that have been discussed for quite a while. The UN came up with the Human Development Index in 1990, informed by, among others, Amartya Sen, and it's a step forward. I mean, he said that it was also a brutal measure, but better than GDP in the sense that it measured a lot of important things like health and education outcomes. People like Nordhaus and Stiglitz and many others have been working on holistic measures. One of the challenges, I would say, is that many of these measures, and the OECD recently came out with 11 themes, a whole bunch of countries have come up with measures, but sometimes you find dozens or over 100 indicators. One of the challenges of these more nuanced measures is that it's not obvious often how to combine all of these into a single measure. And if an economy, for example, is moving backwards on some and forwards on others, it's not clear how to assess that. The other issue is that GDP has this well-defined benchmark, which is dollar transactions, a strength in simplicity and also a weakness. The difficulty with some of these wellbeing indexes is it's not obvious how you weight different measures when you incorporate them all together. That can often be inherently a subjective exercise. Not to say we shouldn't do it, but if you look at the Human Development Index, for example, there's a weighting there, but it's not like it's scientifically derived. It's something that a bunch of very smart people at the UN developed, but it's open to contention. So the final couple of very brief observations I'd make is that the real opportunity, I think, is that a wellbeing index, I think, will push us towards thinking about outcomes. It's one of the real weaknesses of GDP that in the non-market part of the economy, the really important bit, health, education, our justice system, we measure how much we spend, but we don't measure outcomes. And that's not because we're lazy, that's the really difficult bit to measure. But I think pushing a wellbeing index and wellbeing budgets as a priority is going to force us to work much harder at measuring outcomes, using really rigorous techniques, using randomised control trials, actually thinking about what is it we're trying to achieve. The other thing I'd say is that it's going to help us to think about distribution in a more meaningful way. At the moment, the only real way we can think about distribution in GDP is where dollars go. Even that's not equal. But I think if we actually can rigorously measure outcomes, we'll be able to tell an even more meaningful story about distribution, where I'm convinced that the distributions in many ways are more unequal than the expenditure. So I think that GDP has its weaknesses. A new measure is very much warranted, but we should also bear in mind that the new measure is probably going to correct some of the weaknesses of GDP, but in a way that has its own challenges. Thanks.
Thank you. Ryan.
There you go. It's always great speaking third after two exceptionally intelligent and erudite presentations from two exceptionally smart people, both with PhDs. So, my options here, I think, are to attempt to outdo them on intellect or to give you a language warning, and I reckon I'll take the lower of those two roads. Because I think what I want to do in this presentation is probably contextualise the discussion of inclusive growth, why it's important, wellbeing budgets, what they could mean, in a bit of a critique of how public policy and public administration and governing is done in this country, and what we need to learn from that and what the potential benefits might flow from it. Because the point, as an old bearded bloke once told us, is to change the world, and that's what the attempts to drive towards a more inclusive definition of what our economy is and how that relates to our economic and political discourse is a really important way for actually achieving change. First point I think is worth making, first point I really want to get across, is that the reason that things like wellbeing budgeting and inclusive growth matter is that they have the potential to break the stranglehold of economists on the policy debate and policy formulation in this country. And I think that is fundamentally a good thing. When we think about economists as those who are from our very recent tradition of sort of economic orthodoxy. And I say this not just to take cheap shots, but also to think at the way that governing and government works and the way public administration works, the way that our bureaucracy and our public service goes about the task of trying to govern, is that as a former public servant, as a former political advisor who's worked through reforming governments trying to change things, the pervasiveness of the current economic orthodoxy is real in the way that many public servants and the way the public service does its business. The impact of these orthodoxies is I think, quite significant in terms of limiting the scope for what policy directions we're able to achieve, what is considered within the realms of what's possible, what's feasible, and therefore what should matter. Because the way that, Daniel gave us a very good explanation and thoughtful explanation of the role and the way that the formulation of GDP has been, quite frankly, a relatively recent development, and its inclusion along with things like our unemployment rate as being the kind of, if you were to ask anyone in the country, what do you think the indicators of the economy are, and they'd probably say unemployment rate and GDP, they'd probably blur the vision a little bit and get into a debate about the health of the budget, blurring economic and fiscal policy. And they really matter to the way that the business of government is transacted. And if we are to actually think a bit beyond that, we might actually be able to achieve a much more dynamic policy debate and policy formulation here in Australia. Because I think that moving beyond, and again, Daniel mentioned a couple of the things that I think is really problematic with the current calculation of things like GDP and how they're put together, the sort of lack of the value of unpaid work in its context, the fact that it's very temporal, that it's got no ecological context. We're not thinking through the longer term consequences of the inputs and outputs that we're measuring at any particular point in time and how they're going to impact on our world that we're living in over the longer term, means that it's in many respects, a very short-term, very backwards-looking and very temporal system. Which means that the things that policy development tries to do to move the dial on those indicators often, and too often in my view, is limited by those as well. So if we want to get into a more political economic discourse rather than just an economic discourse, I think it's going to open up the scope of what's achievable. I think that's a benefit because what we've seen, and reflecting on some of the discussions about the things that are happening internationally, this kind of lack of trust that people have in what governments can achieve, the sense of the inability of governments to influence the outcome of or the direction of the way markets are operating, as one example, or other sorts of factors that are, people having no control, people seeing that their governments have no control over what the things that are transnational corporations or the like that are having control of people's experiences, means that it's one of the contributors that's breaking down people's sense of trust, sense of engagement in governing and a democratic project. So thinking about a project that measures more than just these economic attributes hopefully, will lead us down a path of of government changing what it does, of government thinking it can do more, and also of people feeling that government can actually do more. And I think for those of us who believe in social democracy, that is a fundamental benefit. The last point I just want to touch on is why more measures and more inclusive measures of growth, or why more inclusive measures of things like health and well-being, however we describe them, are important, is because internally within government and within the bureaucracy, and I don't use that term pejoratively, I think it's an important public institution, our public service, everyone is always motivated by indicators and what they're doing and how their actions are influencing the indicators that the leadership, the government, tells them are important. And if all we're talking about are leading economic indicators of what's the rate of growth, how many people are employed or unemployed, as important as those two things are, if we don't talk about anything else, then people who want to change things in other ways that think will influence on the general well-being of our society have a much harder time at getting support around a cabinet table or around a budget committee table or around an ERC, because there's no clear link between social policy that they're presenting and the kinds of orthodoxies that the economics and the economic theory and the economic theory of how government should work is telling them is important. And I think that that does have a cooling effect on the ability of governments to develop and extrapolate on good social policy. I think that having more indicators will matter a lot more, and we've seen jurisdictions across the world, New Zealand, Scotland to name but two, who've tried to do that. And I was also, and I'll finish on this point, I mean, one of the things I worked on this in the Victorian government in the public service a few years ago. We spent a long time trying to come up with a way of measuring outcomes of what government does. And there was a big debate. We spent a lot of time in workshops, a lot of really great public servants, trying to figure out the attribution between the measures or the programs that we were identifying as being important and the indicators we had available to us to demonstrate whether we had success. Because everyone's like, you've got to be able to prove that it works, right? That was this mantra. I suppose one of the things I'm most happy about, I suppose, or optimistic about, are the comments that Daniel made, is that largely the economists know that it's all bullshit on their side anyway, and that likely that if we don't expect the social indicators or these wellbeing indicators to be just as pure as well, and just go for it, then we may actually achieve the sort of things that we're seeking to in the short, medium and long term.
Thanks, Ryan. I'm sure what you meant to say was temporal, but yeah. Well, look, I mean, I think if we pull together all the threads of that, everyone's in agreement that we should have a broader set of measures, and if we pick up Ryan's point about the excessive concentration on the temporal, we've had the economists sort of leading the show, particularly in the Australian political context. You know, perhaps if you were in Washington DC, you would say the foreign policy community gives it a pretty strong run as well. But in the Australian political environment, in the particularly the last 30 to 40 years, it's been the economists dominating things, and some of that translation has actually narrowed even from GDP down to just purely the fiscal, and you have the marriage of perhaps GDP-based measures as being the broader overall ambitions of government, but it always being assessed for effectiveness against almost a cash accounting-based means of thought about fiscal policy. So it's tightened things down. So the the general agreement seems to be that we've got to be broader, look at more things. I suppose the first question is, how do you do that, and where do you set the limits? I mean, I think, for example, almost 2 years ago now, the LSE economist Manish Tawfiq, who has no radical background, she has a very institutional background, out of the Washington International Economic Institutions and briefly, I think, the Bank of England. And she came to a similar conclusion, albeit with perhaps a more conservative political perspective. But when you read through the book, there's no defining of what a relatively manageable and relatively explainable in government terms set of broader perspectives might be. And then she goes through very thoughtfully on a range of things where the current system and the current systems of measurement and priorities have failed us. And you come out at the end of the book and you think, this is a bit like the butterfly in the jungle in Brazil. Everything's interconnected, but I don't quite know how interconnected it is and what I should be looking at first, and more to the point, what objectives I should be setting and what policy frameworks I should be focusing on and prioritising. So, do any of you have anything to say about how we make it manageable without, throwing, some of the wider considerations that get you beyond purely the economist's view of the world out on the way through, with trying to narrow down your task to define at least a starting point for government. Someone's clearly got a book of answers here, I see. Does anyone go before we go to the floor for some questions?
I'll just make a couple of very quick observations. So one is, I think, and this is a broader topic for another day, but I think sometimes people in some areas of economics will look at disagreements between economists and throw up their hands and say, oh, the whole thing's rubbish. When in fact, I think it's worth remembering that, and I think most sensible economists do remember this, that it's a social science and not a physical science. And there are some bits of economics which are much more empirical, and there are other bits of economics where we're trying to figure out a way to understand human psychology and society, which is a much more complicated, difficult thing. And so I actually think, but then the way you interpret it often has a bit of an ideological lens as well. So for me, the discussions and disagreements we have within economics as a social science, I don't think is a failure. I actually think it's inherent in the nature of the discipline. There are other bits of economics, like what happens if you raise the price of oranges by 5 cents in this particular market, which is a bit more empirical and scientific. But economics is a bit of a mixture of both. And sometimes when we have open discussions about very complex semi-ideological things, we get tarred with having those discussions, which I actually think are part of the discipline. The second thing I guess I wanted to say is that I think a lot of what you were just referring to, David, is the fact that some of what economics is interested in is actually not just economics, but it's actually good public policy. It might actually be called statistics. It might be called evaluation. Sometimes because economists within public service departments often get involved in a lot of this work, it gets conflated. But in fact, I would say that economics is one input into rigorous evaluation. And when I talked about outcomes before, I actually feel that in many areas, and Ryan and I have probably worked in similar documents where in budget papers we have a chapter where it has hundreds, dozens, possibly hundreds of outcomes that we list, we graph things, but we don't really understand what our impact is. We sometimes graph correlations but not necessarily causation, and we certainly don't necessarily understand our net impact. So certain things probably would have happened to a large degree anyway, but what was the impact of the government intervention? So I actually feel like, and this sounds like a very technical and wonky thing, but given the importance of a lot of government activity in people's lives, we really need to prioritise better understanding our impact much, much more. And things like randomised controlled trials, they're actually very hard to get up in government. I've been involved in a lot of social policy evaluation where people will report correlations and that's it, and it maybe makes intuitive sense, but we really don't have much of an understanding of what our impact is. And I feel as though that, to me, transcends economics. That's just about good public policy practice and evaluation. And the final point I'd make is I think we're all agreed that we need to look more broadly and need to measure more. I guess I was just making also the obvious point that the more things you measure, the less that you're inherently prioritising, and I suspect the less that you're really measuring well. And so that's one of the trade-offs I think that we're going to face.
I guess the thing that I'd just add is that in choosing to measure more, and of course, to pick up on, these are all political choices. I think there's probably not enough acknowledgement in our public debates about economic policy that a lot of these structures and systems that we take for granted, they're political choices that, as you said, are informed by ideology. Sometimes we kind of have this hands-off approach as if it's a science, and we can't question that because it's a fact of life. No, these were public policy, political choices that people made along the way. And by the same token, the choice about what to measure is also a political choice. And I think just as important as choosing what to measure is choosing what to target. Presumably if we're measuring inequality, we should, more importantly perhaps, be targeting a reduction of inequality and tracking our progress towards that reduction of inequality and assessing all our policies and programs and budgets and everything against our progress towards our inequality target in a similar way to the closing the gap targets. Same with emissions reduction, same with increasing our global performance in education, whatever it is. So that's what, when Jim Chalmers talks about a wellbeing budget, that's what I kind of think about, that it's an opportunity to re-articulate the goals, the long-term goals, or to use Chalmers' word, the values that should underpin all our economic policy. And the political opportunity for Labor there is to change the whole narrative about what constitutes good economic management in this country and stop playing by the coalition's rule book, okay? So I think Howard and them did a really good job through the wellbeing budget and through rhetoric and through whatever, of brainwashing everybody. Unfortunately, including, it was bipartisan, that certain things make good economic managers, and sometimes I feel like Labor policymakers have also become cornered into that framing of the conversation, which inhibits our policy creativity and our capacity for innovation. A wellbeing budget is a chance to change the narrative, change the conversation, change the benchmarks and the goals about what constitutes a good economy and therefore good economic management. It's a huge political opportunity.
Okay, we'll go to some questions, and on this session we'll have to be reasonably tight on questions. What I would say is we're after questions this time around. So starting up the back here, and I know I've got some questions over here because people approached me beforehand.
Thank you. Thank you, Warren Gardner. I guess I would say it's difficult to be against inclusive growth and wellbeing budget because it's sort of like a motherhood concept, isn't it? But I guess my question is, we're going in some of the details, but my question is, what sort of conceptual framework is this? I work for the Hawke government. The Hawke government talked about the accord to the unions, but it didn't talk about the accord to everyone else. It talked about social justice. Then we stopped talking about social justice. Under Rudd and Gillard, we experimented in talking about social indicators. Social inclusion. Social inclusion turned out to be an intellectual dry creek. Our response to that is to stop talking about it completely. And this would be my criticism also of the Treasurer's essay. It's got to be about moving towards what? I still think going back to social justice.
Would you like to
as a
frame that as a
yeah,
question
well, I'm
to the
just
panel?
saying it's
Yeah.
about what would be an overriding conceptual framework that would make sense to moving forward? And I'd make an observation in passing. I wonder how the focus groups of the demographic groups that Wayne Swan talked about this morning, how would they respond by saying we're going to offer you inclusive growth and a wellbeing budget? I think I know the answer.
Thanks for that. We'll assemble all the questions as a package and try and deal them in one. John Langmore? Yeah.
Of employment. We're getting a bit closer with measuring underemployment, but shouldn't we have one measure that in fact honestly measures employment, not just 1 hour of work a week?
And we'll take one from here, and then we'll come back for two more after we've dealt with this package.
Ross Kirkman. I've been a psychiatrist for 30 years, and my job really is trying to improve the well-being of the people I see. I think it's become apparent over many years in the psychiatric literature and in working as a psychiatrist, the best form of welfare is a job. It improves people's self-esteem, it gives them a structure to their lives, not just a shitty job, but a good job. I want to talk about universal job guarantee, and my question really is to you, David, as a research centre. Because economists poo-hoo the universal job guarantee and modern monetary theory, but no one's actually done a research trial where you give people a guaranteed job and you do a randomised controlled trial and you look at what effect that has on that person. You then start to broaden it into a region, for example, look at issues around inflation. You don't have to measure unemployment anymore if everyone is guaranteed a job. And if everyone has a job, everyone will feel a hell of a lot better. So it's really, as a research institution, I think we need to do the research on the consequences of a guaranteed job.
Right, thank that. And we'll touch, I'll try to touch on that as we close, but the panel first on what we've already got.
I think, just coming to the first question, I don't think that a wellbeing budget or a framework, a results framework or a performance framework is a tool, is something that a political narrative discourse is going to win the hearts and minds of the population, because it's an inherently inward insider mechanism, which is why no one cares what is written in the Australian, but it's a very valuable thing if we want to actually make change. My point that I was trying to make is if we want to actually change the way our government and governing in Australia works, we need to have that insider conversation. It's up to others in a wider political discourse to be talking about the concepts that change people's hearts and minds from a more values-based and purpose-based perspective. And I don't think we should think that this kind of an approach is going to do that.
I'll pick up on, in part, John Langmore's question, and I think this is a good example of where measurement matters. If you look at the economy over the last 50 years, I think unemployment was probably a much better indicator of how people were faring in the labour market 50 years ago, when full-time employment was much more predominant. And one graph that comes to mind is that I think they crossed paths in the early 90s, and that since the early 90s, underemployment has overtaken unemployment and is now far more significant. And as John alludes to, what we don't want is a measure where we're artificially measuring people as having a good outcome, where they're not employed for many hours, and in particular, where they want a lot more hours. So I think we're doing better at measuring that, but I think it's a classic example of where we need more work, and where the measures that we use, and this goes to some technicalities, but we need to think much harder ultimately about what is it that we're trying to achieve. And in a sense, what we're trying to achieve, as everybody in this room is alluding to, is a situation where people that want work get work. And that's what we're ultimately trying to achieve. And that's why I think the ABS is now putting much more effort into measuring underemployment. But of course, even now, we're not doing a great job probably of measuring people who are out of the labour force and would come in under certain circumstances. But it's a great example of where once you start to clarify the outcomes that you're after, it helps you think about the devices that you want to use to get there. And again, just to take up my role on this panel as being the economic orthodoxy in part at least. So look, for me, obviously where we want to be heading is an economy where people who want to work can work and can get jobs that are high quality and secure and provide them with meaning. And look, I totally, everything that I've read fully supports the perspective that you put, which is that people get so much meaning from work. But, and this goes partly to some of the issues that Shireen raised, but I suppose as somebody who wouldn't say that I'm slavishly orthodox macroeconomist, but inflation is often a problem in societies, and it's something that is complex. We don't fully understand it, but I do think we have to acknowledge we've just come out of 25 years where inflation was largely controlled for a whole bunch of reasons which we still don't yet understand. But if you go back in the preceding 100 years, inflation was often highly problematic and difficult to control, and often it hurt the people that we're here to represent most of all. Now, if we could get to full employment without any inflationary pressures, I'd sign up. Can we? Look, perhaps we can get closer to it, but history suggests it's going to be tricky. And I think as much as we should, I think, totally hold the Reserve Bank to account for its foibles in communication and governance and many other things, I also think we're going through an important time where as a movement that's trying to protect the most vulnerable in society, the impact that inflation that is both high and potentially unpredictable and potentially accelerating has on people on fixed incomes and people who find it hard to protect themselves, I think it's important to acknowledge that as a huge challenge and not one that's easily resolved. For me, economic management as a bland term doesn't mean a lot, but if economic management in part is about trying to control a macroeconomic phenomenon that hurts the worst off in society, that is important to have as part of our toolkit.
Could I just jump in there? To be clear, I'm certainly not advocating that true full employment should be pursued at the expense of stable prices, right? I'm advocating that we need to find a fairer synthesis of the two really important goals of true full employment and stable prices. And what I'm saying is, I just don't believe that there isn't a better solution out there. There's a lot of smart people in this room and a lot of smart people across the country. And I reckon if we really turned our minds to it and opened our minds to innovation and opened our minds to some of the heterodox ideas that are out there, that rather than dismissing them, I'm not saying they're perfect and that they'll work without whatever, but turn our minds to it, grapple with it. I refuse to believe that economic innovation is finished. That's not the way innovation works. You know, if the 80s Accord was a radical centre synthesis, that synthesis over time hardens into the thesis. It becomes the orthodoxy, it becomes stale. I think that's what Keating was getting at. It needs renovation. So that's the thesis. We've got an antithesis proposition. MMT has provided an antithesis proposition. I'm saying let's wholesomely, wholeheartedly grapple with these disagreements, grapple with these different ideas. Let's test it out. As you said, let's do some trials. I refuse to believe that the only way or the most efficient way or the most productive way to control inflation is to bring down working people's wages who are already getting wage cuts and who didn't cause this inflation, by the way, and making people unemployed. That is a very roundabout and very cruel way to fight inflation. I don't think it's the best answer that's out there.
Thanks for that, Shireen. I'm going to be very brutal. We're just going to take one question from the woman there with the microphone, and then we're going to cut it out. What it's telling me is convener of this conference that next time round I'm going to run a couple of sessions around this sort of topic. But can I take your question?
Yes, it's Kim Liu here. I've been a doctor for 34 years, and I think what the conversation hasn't included is well-being is also the health of the community. We forget the externalities of social inequities and climate change actually deepen social inequity. We get more death and more harm within community. The health sector is 7% of the GDP. And in Western Sydney, where I work, 85% of our adult population has a metabolic problem. So that means only 15% of people are well. Many people suffer through the gig economy and everything else. So there are hard values we can look at, besides looking at morbidity and mortality, so the death and harm, and the rise in the health dollar from doing nothing. So well-being is such an important thing to look at when you look at the welfare of the community. When you look at GDP, it has to be more than just dollars. Because to raise the GDP, the cheapest way would be light a match and burn this building down. Right? Because if you look in dollars, you're not looking at the health of the community. And this is not a question, it is a bit of a statement, but I'm just saying it really does, it's such an important factor.
Thanks for that. Any final comments from the panel? No? Ryan's going to be very well behaved because... No. Good. Okay, look, I'd very much like to thank the panel for joining this conversation this afternoon. It's clearly a conversation that could go a lot further and in many directions. So we might look in terms of our work program over the coming year about how we might explore that on a more niche basis for those who want to go deeper. We will have one very, very quick break. This is a 5-minute one, and then we'll bring back a panel on what the community is looking like these days and the electoral implications. And in fact, that's not totally devoid from what we've just been discussing, because we'll be bringing the people who get us into government.